If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Jim Hawkins. I'm 41 years old, and I work as a park ranger up here in the Boundary Waters Canoe area of Minnesota. It's late autumn, 1963, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. The leaves have turned to brilliant reds and golds, but most of them have already fallen, leaving the ancient pine trees standing tall and dark against the misty sky. The lakes are quiet, their surfaces like glass reflecting the gray clouds above. It's beautiful, sure, but there's something about this place that feels heavy, like the forest is watching you. The tourists are gone now, too cold for camping this time of year, and I'm the only one left at this remote station. Well, me and Scout, my German shepherd. He's been with me since Korea, my only real friend these days. The nights are getting colder, and soon winter will lock this place down with snow and ice. I volunteered for this post to get away from everything. My past, my nightmares, my mistakes, but out here, it's hard to escape your own thoughts. A few days ago, I heard on the radio that President Kennedy had been shot. The ranger station crackled with static as the news came through. It felt surreal hearing about something so big while sitting alone in a tiny cabin surrounded by endless trees. It made me feel even more cut off from the rest of the world. But honestly, that's what I wanted when I took this job. Solitude. The thing is, solitude can play tricks on your mind. The silence out here isn't peaceful. It's eerie. You'd expect to hear birds or squirrels or something, but most of the time, it's just quiet. Too quiet. And when there is a sound like a branch snapping or water lapping against the shore, it carries in a way that makes you feel like you're not alone. There are islands scattered across these lakes, some no bigger than a house. A few have strange stone formations on them, old circles of rocks that don't look natural. The locals say they were made by the Ojibwe people long ago as part of their ceremonies. They also say this land is guarded by spirits who don't take kindly to outsiders poking around where they shouldn't. I've always respected those stories. My dad used to tell me that every legend has a bit of truth in it. And after everything I've seen in my life, I believe him. But lately, I've been feeling like there's more truth to those stories than I ever wanted to know. It started with little things you could explain away if you tried hard enough. Tracks near the cabin that looked like deer prints but weren't quite right. Whistling sounds in the distance when there shouldn't have been anyone around. Scout growling at nothing in particular or refusing to go into certain parts of the forest no matter how much I coaxed him. Then there were the hunters who came through last month and told me they'd seen something strange. A shadow moving faster than any animal should be able to move, and a smell like rotting meat hanging in the air. They laughed it off over beers at first, but you could see in their eyes that they were scared. And then 3 hikers went missing. No one knows what happened to them. They just vanished without a trace. Search parties combed through the woods for days but found nothing except some torn-up gear near one of those stone circles on an island out in the lake. That's when I started sleeping with my rifle loaded and close by. I don't scare easy. I've seen war, I've faced death, but there's something about this place that gets under your skin. It's not just the isolation or the cold or even the strange things people say they've seen out here. It's this feeling that you're being watched, like there's something just out of sight, hiding among the trees. And whatever it is, it doesn't want you here. I guess I should tell you a bit more about myself. Like I said, my name's Jim Hawkins. I've been a park ranger for a few years now, but before this, I was a Marine. Served in Korea as a sniper. That's where I got the scar on my left cheek, shrapnel from an explosion. It's not something I like to talk about much. The war, it changed me, made me see things no man should ever have to see. And when I came back, well, I wasn't the same person anymore. My wife Sarah tried to stick it out with me, but she couldn't handle it. My nightmare, my drinking, the way I'd shut down and push her away, she left about 2 years ago. Can't say I blame her. After that, I figured it was better for everyone if I just kept to myself. That's how I ended up here, in the middle of nowhere. I've always felt more at home in the wilderness than around people anyway. Out here, things make sense. You can track an animal by its prints, Tell the time by the position of the sun and survive if you know what you're doing. My dad taught me all that when I was a kid, how to hunt, fish, and live off the land. He also gave me his hunting knife before he passed, a sturdy old blade that's been in our family for generations. It's one of the few things I have left of him. Scout's my other constant. He's a big German shepherd with a coat as black as midnight and eyes sharp enough to see through you. We've been through a lot together. He was with me in Korea, trained to sniff out mines and protect our unit. He saved my life more times than I can count, and now he's saving me in a different way. Without him, this place would feel unbearable. The thing about Scout is, he knows things before I do. He'll growl or whimper when something's not right, even if I can't see or hear anything yet. Lately, he's been acting strange, staring into the trees like he sees something moving out there or refusing to follow me into certain parts of the forest. It's not like him to be scared of anything, and that makes me uneasy. I've been sober for 6 months now, not an easy feat when you're alone with your thoughts in a place like this. But some nights are harder than others, especially now that weird things have started happening around here. The tracks near the cabin, the whistling sounds, the missing hikers. It's enough to make anyone reach for a bottle. But I can't afford to lose focus out here, not with Scout depending on me and whatever's going on in these woods getting closer by the day. The locals warned me about this place when I first took the job. They told me about the spirits that guard these waterways, the ones from Ojibwe legends. They said you have to respect them or they'll make sure you regret it. At first I thought it was just stories meant to scare off outsiders like me, but now I'm not so sure. There's something out there in those trees. Something that doesn't belong in this world, and whatever it is, it's getting closer. It started with the tracks. I was out behind the ranger station one morning, checking the perimeter like I always do. The frost on the ground was thick, crunching under my boots as I walked. That's when I saw them, hoof prints. At first I thought it was just a deer passing through, but when I crouched down for a closer look, something about them didn't sit right. They were too big for one thing, and the spacing between them. It was all wrong. It looked like whatever made them was walking on 2 legs, not 4. I stared at those tracks for a long time trying to make sense of them. Maybe it was just an injured deer, I told myself. Or maybe the frost had warped the shape somehow. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Scout came up behind me then, his ears perked and his nose twitching. He sniffed the tracks once and let out a low growl, his hackles rising. That's when I felt it. The hair on the back of my neck standing up like someone was watching me. I turned around quickly, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing there. Just mist hanging low over the forest and the sound of my own breathing. I tried to shake it off and went back inside, but that feeling stuck with me all day. Then there were the sounds. A few nights later, I was sitting by the wood stove in the cabin, reading an old book to pass the time. Scout was lying by my feet, his head resting on his paws. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees creak. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, so I didn't think much of it until I heard whistling. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded like someone whistling a tune out in the woods, slow and deliberate. The kind of whistle you'd use to call a dog or get someone's attention. Scout's head shot up immediately, his ears swiveling toward the door. He let out a soft whine and stood up, pacing back and forth nervously. My stomach tightened as I grabbed my rifle from where it leaned against the wall and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap in the face as I scanned the darkness with my flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. The whistling had stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even worse. "Hello?" I called out into the night, my voice sounding small and uncertain against the vastness of the forest. No answer. I stood there for what felt like forever before finally going back inside and locking the door behind me. Scout wouldn't settle down after that. He kept pacing and growling at nothing until I finally gave up on sleep altogether. And then there were the hunters. 2 local guys showed up at the station about a week after that night. They were rough-looking men in their 40s. Beards thick with frost and rifles slung over their shoulders. They told me they'd been out tracking elk near one of the lakes when they saw something strange. It wasn't no elk, one of them said, shaking his head as he lit a cigarette with trembling hands. Biggest damn shadow I've ever seen, moved faster than anything should be able to move. Smelled like death, the other added quietly, staring down at his boots. They didn't stick around long after that. Just grabbed some supplies and left in a hurry, like they couldn't wait to get out of here. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. But what really got to me were the animal carcasses. I found them scattered around different parts of the forest. Rabbits, deer, even a bear once, all drained of blood with these strange cuts on their bodies. The cuts were too clean to be from another animal, almost surgical in precision. It didn't make any sense. Scout refused to go near any of them. He'd whimper and back away with his tail tucked between his legs every time we came across one. And if Scout was scared, well, that scared me too. The final straw came when my compass stopped working. I'd been out on one of those islands in the lake, you know, the ones with those old stone formations, and noticed my compass needle spinning wildly like it didn't know which way was north anymore. At first I thought it might be broken, but when I stepped off the island back onto my canoe, it started working fine again. That night I had a dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. In it I was standing in those woods again, surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to blot out the sky. And somewhere in those trees, something was watching me. Its eyes glowed amber in the darkness like fireflies floating just out of reach. When I woke up drenched in sweat with Scout barking at nothing in particular, that's when I knew this wasn't just my imagination running wild anymore. Something is out there, and whatever it is, it's getting closer every day. I didn't see it at first, not really, but I felt it. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and the forest was deathly quiet. Scout and I were out by the edge of the lake, checking on some traps I'd set earlier in the day. The moon was high, its pale light reflecting off the still water, and the air was so cold it burned with every breath. Scout was tense, his ears perked, and his nose working overtime. He kept glancing toward the tree line, letting out these low, uneasy growls. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere in the distance. It wasn't loud, but out here, where every sound carries, it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze, my hand tightening around the rifle slung over my shoulder. Scout stopped growling and went completely still, his body rigid like a coiled spring. Probably just a deer, I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow in the cold air. But then came another sound, soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the frost. They weren't heavy like a bear or quick like a deer's. They were slow, measured, almost human. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trunks and tangled branches. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steady but my heart pounding in my chest. "If someone's out there, you're on restricted land. Show yourself." Silence. Scout let out a sharp bark and lunged forward, his leash pulling tight in my hand. He was staring into the trees now, his teeth bared and his growl deepening to something primal. My flashlight followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the breeze. And then, it moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow slipping between two trees too quickly for me to focus on. But then I saw it again, something tall and impossibly thin darting from one trunk to another with unnatural speed. It didn't make a sound as it moved, not a single crunch of frost or rustle of leaves. My stomach twisted into knots as I raised my rifle and aimed into the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "This isn't funny." No answer. But then came the smell, a sickening stench like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. It hit me all at once, so strong that I gagged and had to cover my nose with my sleeve. Scout whimpered and backed up against me, his tail tucked between his legs, and that's when I saw its eyes. Two glowing amber orbs appeared in the darkness, hovering about 9 feet off the ground. They didn't blink or waver. They just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe, like those eyes had pinned me in place. Then it stepped into the light. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. Tall and gaunt with skin stretched so tightly over its bones that it looked like it might tear at any moment. Its face was elongated like a deer's skull but twisted into something grotesquely human. Massive antlers jutted from its head, their tips scraping against low-hanging branches as it moved closer. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing sharp yellowed teeth stained with blood, and then it spoke. "Help me." The voice was soft and weak, like a woman's, but there was something wrong about it. It sounded hollow, like it wasn't coming from its throat but from somewhere deeper inside its chest. I knew better than to trust what I was hearing. I'd heard stories about creatures that could mimic human voices to lure their prey, but hearing it for myself sent chills down my spine. Scout barked again, snapping me out of my trance. Without thinking, I fired a shot into the air, a warning, and shouted at whatever this thing was to stay back. It didn't flinch or react in any way. Instead, it tilted its head slightly to one side, almost like it was curious about me, and then it disappeared. 1 second it was standing there in front of me. The next it dissolved into mist so quickly that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined the whole thing. The smell lingered for a moment longer before fading away completely. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping my rifle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Scout pressed against my leg, trembling but silent now. Finally, I forced myself to move, backing away slowly until we reached the canoe by the water's edge. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to untie the rope before we could push off into the lake. As we paddled back toward the ranger station under that cold moonlight, one thought kept running through my mind. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me yet. I barely slept after that encounter by the lake. Every sound outside the cabin made me jump, and Scout was just as restless. He'd pace by the door, growling low in his throat, his ears twitching at noises only he could hear. I kept my rifle loaded and close by, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some animal. It was something worse. A few days later, the storm hit. The blizzard came out of nowhere, howling through the trees and burying everything in snow within hours. The wind slammed against the cabin walls, shaking them so hard I thought they might collapse. Scout and I were stuck inside, huddled by the wood stove as the temperature plummeted. I thought we'd be safe in the cabin. I thought wrong. It started with a sound, a faint scratching at first, like branches brushing against the windows, but then it got louder, more deliberate. Something, or someone, was outside. Scout's ears perked up immediately. He let out a sharp bark and ran to the door, his tail stiff and his body tense. My heart raced as I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window. The glass was frosted over, but I could just make out a shadow moving through the snow. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the wind. No answer. The scratching stopped for a moment, replaced by an eerie silence. Then came a loud thud against the door so hard it rattled on its hinges. Scout barked furiously, throwing himself at the door as if trying to scare off whatever was on the other side. I stepped back, my hands trembling as I raised the rifle. "Stay back," I yelled. And then, it spoke. "Jim." The voice was soft but clear, cutting through the storm like a knife. It wasn't human, it couldn't be, but it sounded just enough like one to send chills down my spine. "Jim, let me in." It knew my name. I froze, my mind racing. How could it know my name? Was it mimicking someone? Was it reading my thoughts? Before I could figure it out, there was another thud, this one harder than before, and the door cracked under the pressure. Scout lunged at the door again, barking wildly. That's when it happened. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and the cold wind rushed in like a living thing. Snow swirled into the cabin, blinding me for a moment. And then I saw it, the creature from the lake. It stood in the doorway, its massive antlers scraping against the frame as it ducked inside. Its glowing amber eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. It was even more terrifying up close, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Scout didn't hesitate. He charged at the creature with everything he had, barking and snapping at its legs. But it didn't flinch, not even when Scout sank his teeth into its ankle. Instead, it let out this horrible sound, a mix between a growl and a scream that made my blood run cold. "Scout, no," I shouted, but it was too late. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. It grabbed Scout by the neck and threw him across the room like he weighed nothing. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and fell limp to the floor. "Scout!" I screamed again, but he didn't move. Rage and fear surged through me as I fired my rifle straight at the creature's chest. The shot echoed through the cabin, but when the smoke cleared, it was still standing. The bullet hadn't even slowed it down. I backed away slowly, reloading as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. The creature took a step toward me, its eyes never leaving mine. Frost spread across the floor with every step it took, creeping closer like icy fingers, reaching for me, desperate. I grabbed a burning log from the wood stove and swung it at the creature with all my strength. The flames licked at its skin, and for the first time it recoiled, letting out another ear-piercing scream as it stumbled backward into the snowstorm outside. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. Grabbing what little supplies I could carry and Scout's lifeless body, I fled into the storm. The storm was relentless. The wind whipped at my face and the snow came down so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. My arms ached as I carried Scout's limp body through the forest, stumbling over roots and rocks hidden beneath the snow. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. That thing was out there, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The only place I could think of was the old Ojibwe ceremonial site. One of the locals had told me about it when I first took this job. He said it was a sacred place protected by the spirits of the forest. I didn't know if I believed him, but right now it was my only hope. I don't know how long I wandered through the storm before I found it. The stone circle rose up out of the snow like a beacon. The rocks weathered and ancient but still standing strong. The air around the site felt different, still cold but calmer somehow. Like the storm couldn't touch this place. I laid Scout down gently in the center of the circle, my heart breaking as I looked at him. He'd been my companion through everything. The war, my darkest days, and now this. And now he was gone. "I'm sorry, boy," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, but I didn't have time to grieve." The creature was coming. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that same heavy, suffocating presence that had been haunting me for days. I grabbed some dry branches from beneath the snow and piled them in the center of the circle. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get a fire going with my lighter. Once the flames caught, they seemed to burn brighter than they should have, casting long shadows across the stones. I remembered what one of the elders had told me about this place, how fire and certain herbs could ward off evil spirits. Digging through my pack, I found a small pouch of sage that one of the locals had given me as a gift when I arrived. At the time, I thought it was just a kind gesture. Now, I realized it might save my life. I threw the sage into the fire, and almost immediately, the air around me seemed to shift. The wind outside the circle grew louder, angrier, but it couldn't penetrate the space where I stood. And then it appeared. The creature stepped out of the trees, its massive form barely visible through the swirling snow. Its glowing amber eyes locked onto mine as it moved closer, slow and deliberate. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew there was nowhere for me to run. "Jim." It spoke again in that hollow voice that made my skin crawl. "Why do you run?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed my father's hunting knife from my belt and held it tightly in one hand while keeping my other hand near the fire. The creature stopped just outside the circle, tilting its head as if studying me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the howling wind beyond. Then it lunged. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. One moment it was standing still, the next it was on top of me, its claws slashing through my coat as we tumbled to the ground. The knife slipped from my hand as I struggled against its weight, its foul breath hot against my face. Desperate, I reached for a burning branch from the fire and jammed it into its side with all my strength. The creature let out an ear-splitting scream and recoiled, giving me just enough time to scramble back toward the flames. It circled me now, pacing just outside the ring of stones like a predator sizing up its prey. Its eyes burned brighter than ever, filled with rage and something else. Fear. That's when I realized it couldn't enter the circle. The stones weren't just markers, they were protection. I grabbed more sage from my pack and threw it into the fire, chanting under my breath words I barely remembered from an Ojibwe elder who'd once shared them with me. Gitchi Manitou, protect us. Gitchi Manitou, protect us. Over and over again. The creature howled in fury as frost spread across its body like cracks in ice. It clawed at its own skin as if trying to tear itself apart but couldn't break free from whatever force was holding it back. Finally, with one last scream that echoed through the forest like thunder, it vanished into thin air. The moment the creature vanished, the storm began to ease. The wind softened and the snow stopped falling so thick, it was as if the forest itself had been holding its breath and finally let it out. But I didn't feel relief, not yet. My hands still trembled, my heart still pounded in my chest, and my eyes darted around, half expecting the thing to reappear at any second. I stayed in that stone circle for what felt like hours, feeding the fire and clutching my father's knife like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The air around me felt heavy, like the forest was watching, waiting to see what I'd do next. Finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, I knelt beside Scout. His body was cold now, his fur stiff under my fingers. I tried not to cry. I told myself I needed to stay strong. But when I looked at his face, so still and lifeless, something inside me broke. He'd been with me through everything. He'd saved me more times than I could count. And now he was gone. I'm sorry, I whispered again. My voice cracking, you deserved better than this. I knew I couldn't leave him there. He wasn't just a dog. He was family. So I dug a grave in the frozen ground just outside the circle, using my knife and bare hands when the shovel in my pack wasn't enough. The cold bit into my skin, and every movement sent pain shooting through my frostbitten fingers, but I didn't stop until it was done. When I laid him to rest, I whispered a quiet prayer, one of the few things I remembered from my childhood, and covered him with earth and stones to keep him safe. By the time I finished, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. The storm had passed completely now, leaving the forest eerily quiet once again. But it didn't feel like before. It didn't feel like something was watching anymore. I made my way back to the ranger station slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. My body ached from head to toe, and my fingers were numb from the cold. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked like a war zone. The door hung off its hinges. Snow had blown inside and covered everything, and there were claw marks gouged deep into the walls. I didn't stay long. I packed up what little gear hadn't been destroyed and radioed for help. The signal was weak. Static crackled over the line, but eventually, someone responded. A rescue team would come for me in a few hours. But even as I waited for them to arrive, sitting by what was left of the wood stove with a blanket wrapped around me for warmth, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The rescue team found me later that day and took me to a hospital in town. They said I was lucky to be alive, that most people wouldn't have survived out there in conditions like that. They asked me what happened, about the damage to the cabin and why Scout wasn't with me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them everything. Who would believe me? A 9-foot-tall creature with glowing eyes and antlers? A monster that could mimic human voices? They'd think I'd lost my mind. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. I transferred to another park after that, somewhere far away from those woods, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape what happened. At night, when everything is quiet and still, I sometimes hear that voice again, soft and hollow, calling my name. And then there are the dreams, the ones where I'm back in those woods, surrounded by trees so tall they block out the sky. In those dreams, something is always watching me from just beyond the firelight, waiting for its chance. A few years later, reports started coming in from other rangers in that area. Strange tracks in the snow, missing hikers, animals found dead with no explanation. They asked if I wanted to come back as a consultant, since no one knew those woods better than me. I said yes. I don't know why. Maybe it's guilt for leaving Scout behind, or maybe it's because deep down some part of me knows this isn't over yet. The last time anyone saw me was during another blizzard up there, a storm even worse than before. When they found my journal weeks later in an abandoned cabin near one of those stone circles, it was filled with detailed notes about what had happened and warnings for whoever came next. The final entry read, It doesn't die, it waits. My name is Maria Vasquez, and I've spent most of my life exploring caves, dark, cold, and endless tunnels that stretch beneath the earth like veins. Some people find them terrifying, but to me, they've always felt like home. Well, most of the time. It was the summer of 1978 when everything changed. I was working as a ranger at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. The park was buzzing with tourists because of a recent National Geographic feature that called our caves a wonder of the natural world. People came from all over to see the massive chambers, the strange limestone formations, and the bats, millions of them, that filled the skies at dusk like living clouds. But what most people didn't know was that Carlsbad's beauty hid something darker. Beneath the well-lit paths and guided tours were miles of unexplored tunnels. Some were so narrow you had to crawl on your stomach to get through. Others were sealed off entirely, too dangerous for even experienced cavers like me. A few weeks earlier, there had been an earthquake. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to shake things up underground. Some of the older passages collapsed, while others opened up for the first time in who knows how long. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it was little things. The bats, which usually followed predictable patterns, began acting strangely. They flew out of the caves earlier than usual and didn't come back until much later or not at all. Then a maintenance worker disappeared while replacing lights in one of the deeper chambers. We searched for days but found nothing except his flashlight lying in a pool of water. Tourists started reporting strange things too, whispers echoing through empty tunnels, shadows moving where no one should have been. One woman swore she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from a crack in the wall. We chalked it up to nerves or overactive imaginations. After all, caves can play tricks on your mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, while I was cataloging some old maps in the ranger station, I got a call from one of my colleagues. He'd found something near one of the newly opened passages, ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock. They looked like warning spirals and jagged shapes surrounding figures that seemed almost human. I told myself it was just another mystery waiting to be solved, another piece of history buried beneath our feet. But deep down I felt something else. A gnawing sense of dread I hadn't felt since my brother died in a cave collapse 2 years ago. That's where the story really begins, with me standing at the edge of an uncharted passageway, flashlight in hand, staring into a darkness so deep it felt alive, and I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side. My name is Maria Vasquez, and if there's one thing people know about me, it's that I don't give up easily. I guess you could say I'm stubborn, but in my line of work, that's not a bad thing. Being a ranger isn't just about guiding tourists and telling them not to touch the rocks. It's about protecting the caves and sometimes protecting people from what's inside them. I wasn't always a ranger though. Before this, I was a geology professor. I loved teaching, but I had this theory about ancient cave dwellers, people who might have lived underground thousands of years ago. My colleagues laughed at me, said I was chasing fairy tales, so I left. It wasn't an easy decision, but the caves called to me in a way nothing else ever had. Working at Carlsbad was supposed to be a fresh start, and for a while it was. I discovered 3 new species of cave insects, and even had one named after me, a tiny beetle with no eyes that lived its whole life in complete darkness. But no matter how much I accomplished, there was always something pulling me deeper into the caves, into the unknown. I think part of it was my brother. His name was Luis, and he was my best friend. We grew up exploring caves in Mexico with our grandfather, who used to tell us stories about spirits that lived underground. He gave me this silver pendant shaped like a bat when I was 10 and told me it would keep me safe. I still wear it every day. 2 years ago, Luis and I were on a caving trip in Chiapas when the tunnel we were in collapsed. I made it out alive. He didn't. Since then, every time I step into a cave, there's this voice in the back of my mind telling me to turn around, to get out while I still can. But I don't listen. Maybe it's because I feel closer to him down there, or maybe it's because I know he wouldn't want me to stop. Still, caves aren't easy for me anymore. Most people don't know this about me, but I have claustrophobia. It started after the accident with Luis. The walls feel like they're closing in sometimes, and my chest gets tight like I can't breathe. But I've learned how to push through it because if there's one thing worse than fear, it's regret. I keep journals of all my explorations, maps, sketches, notes about local folklore. The stories are fascinating. Tales of lost explorers, hidden treasures, and strange creatures that live where no light ever reaches. Most of them are just legends, or at least that's what I used to think. The night after we found those petroglyphs near the new passageway, I couldn't sleep. Something about them felt different. Like they weren't just art but a warning left by people who knew these caves better than anyone else ever could. The next morning, when the sun was already baking the desert above us and tourists were lining up for their guided tours, I decided to take another look at that passageway. It wasn't on any map we had in the station, not even the old ones from the 1940s. As I stood there staring into the darkness again, flashlight in hand and heart pounding in my chest, all I could think was, what if this is what I've been looking for all along? I don't scare easily. After years of crawling through tight spaces and dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above jagged rocks, you learn to keep your nerves in check. But something about that new passageway made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the silence. Caves are never truly quiet. There's always the sound of dripping water, the rustle of bats, or even the faint hum of wind moving through cracks in the rock. But here, nothing. It was like the cave itself was holding its breath. The first sign that something was wrong came a few days after we found the petroglyphs. The bats started leaving. Normally, they'd pour out of the cave every evening like a black river, their wings filling the sky as they hunted for insects. But now, they were flying out earlier and in smaller groups, as if something inside had spooked them. By the end of the week, entire sections of the cave were empty. No bats, no crickets, not even spiders. Then there was the maintenance worker, Kyle. He'd been sent to replace some lights in one of the deeper chambers and never came back. At first, we thought he'd just gotten lost. It happens more often than you'd think, even to experienced cavers. But when we found his flashlight lying on the ground near a shallow pool of water, still on but flickering weakly, I knew it wasn't just a case of someone taking a wrong turn. We organized a search party, rangers and volunteers combing through every tunnel and crevice we could reach. We called his name until our voices echoed back at us like ghosts, but there was no sign of him. Not even a footprint. That's when tourists started reporting strange things. A man claimed he heard whispers coming from one of the off-limits passages. A woman swore she saw glowing red eyes watching her from a crack in the wall. Most of us brushed it off as overactive imaginations or tricks of light and shadow. Caves can mess with your senses if you're not used to them. But then I found something that made my stomach drop. It was an old journal tucked away in a storage room near the ranger station. The cover was cracked and faded, but inside were pages filled with notes from 1947, written by another ranger who'd worked here decades ago. He described strange vibrations deep within the caves, bats abandoning their roosts, and people disappearing without a trace. His last entry simply read, "Down there watching." I didn't know what to make of it at first. Maybe it was just an old story meant to scare newcomers like me. But as I read those words over and over again, I couldn't shake this feeling that history was repeating itself. A few nights later, I decided to go back to that new passageway alone. It wasn't exactly protocol. I should have had at least one other ranger with me, but I needed answers. I told myself it was just to check for structural damage or unstable rocks after the earthquake, but deep down, I think I already knew there was something else waiting for me down there. As I stepped into the tunnel, my flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness ahead of me. The air felt colder here than anywhere else in the cave system, cold enough that I could see my breath clouding in front of me like smoke. And then I heard it, a clicking sound, faint but distinct, echoing through the tunnel like someone tapping two stones together. It wasn't coming from behind me or ahead. It seemed to be all around me at once. I froze, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. Hello? My voice sounded small and hollow in the vast emptiness. The clicking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence again, the kind that makes your ears ring and your heart pound louder than it should. And then, footsteps. Soft at first, like bare feet on stone, but growing louder and faster as they approached from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. I didn't wait to find out what or who it was. Turning on my heel, I ran back toward the main chamber as fast as I could without looking back. When I finally reached the safety of the well-lit area where tourists gathered during the day, I leaned against a rock wall to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my flashlight. Whatever was down there, it wasn't human. I didn't tell anyone about what I heard in the tunnel that night. Maybe it was fear, or maybe I just didn't want to sound crazy. Either way, I kept it to myself and tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the echo of my own footsteps or some loose rocks shifting in the dark. But deep down, I knew better. A few days later, I decided to go back. This time, I brought more gear, extra batteries for my flashlight, a small camera, and a handheld radio. I told myself it was just for safety, but the truth was, I wanted proof. If something was down there, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The passageway felt even colder this time, like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in little white puffs as I moved deeper into the tunnel. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my ears. Then I heard it again, the clicking. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of dripping water. But as I moved further in, it grew louder and more rhythmic, like someone tapping stones together in a strange pattern. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going. The tunnel opened up into a small chamber, and that's when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, pale shapes flitting between the stalagmites at the edge of my flashlight's beam. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were creatures. They stood on two legs, but were impossibly thin, their skin pale and almost translucent like wax paper. They had no eyes, just smooth patches of skin where their sockets should have been, and their heads tilted from side to side as if they were listening for something. Their arms were long and spindly, ending in claw-like fingers that scraped against the stone as they moved. I froze, barely daring to breathe. There were 3 of them at first, but then more began to emerge from the shadows. 5, 6, maybe more. They moved silently, except for the clicking sounds that seemed to come from deep within their throats. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. It could have been seconds or minutes. It felt like time had stopped. Then one of them turned its head toward me. I don't know how it knew I was there. Maybe it heard my heartbeat or smelled my fear. But as soon as it turned, the others followed. They all stood still for a moment, their heads cocked like they were trying to figure out what I was. And then they moved. They didn't walk. They skittered across the floor like insects, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One of them climbed up the wall and onto the ceiling, moving so fast it was almost a blur. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight as panic took over. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The creatures stopped just a few feet away from me, their heads tilting again as if they were studying me. That's when I noticed something else. The walls of the chamber were covered in markings. At first glance, they looked like scratches or cracks in the rock, but as my flashlight swept over them, I realized they formed patterns, symbols that looked almost like a language, and among those symbols were bones, human bones. Some were arranged in strange patterns on the floor, others were wedged into cracks in the walls like offerings. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this wasn't just a random cave, it was their nest. One of the creatures reached out toward me with its clawed hand, and that's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. Without thinking, I turned and ran back toward the tunnel as fast as I could. The clicking sounds grew louder behind me, closer with every step, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out into the main chamber of the cave system, where tourists gathered during the day, everything was quiet again. The creatures hadn't followed me beyond their nest, or at least that's what I told myself. I leaned against a rock wall, gasping for air and clutching my flashlight like it was a lifeline. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it twice before managing to turn it off. Whatever those things were, they weren't human, and they weren't supposed to exist. The next morning, I was called into the ranger station. 2 tourists had gone missing the previous evening after wandering into one of the off-limits areas. They hadn't returned to their hotel, and their car was still in the parking lot. My stomach sank as I listened to the details. I knew exactly where they'd gone, the same passage where I'd seen those creatures. A search team was quickly assembled. Frank Delgado, one of the most experienced rangers on staff, would lead the group. I volunteered to go with him, even though my hands were trembling as I packed my gear. Rookie Ranger Peterson joined us too. Looking nervous but determined, we carried radios, extra lights, and emergency flares. Deep down, I wasn't sure any of it would help. As we descended into the caves, the air grew colder and heavier. The deeper we went, the more uneasy everyone became. Even Frank, who had been a ranger for over 20 years, seemed tense. "Stay close," he said quietly, as we entered the uncharted passage. The tunnel twisted and turned like a maze, narrowing in places so much that we had to crawl on our hands and knees. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Then we found something, a camera, lying in the dirt. It belonged to one of the missing tourists. Frank picked it up and checked the footage. The last video showed shaky images of a dark tunnel and faint clicking sounds in the background. The camera jerked suddenly, and then there was nothing but static. We pressed on, moving cautiously through the darkness. That's when we heard it, the clicking. It echoed through the tunnel, faint at first, but growing louder with every step we took. Peterson froze in his tracks. "What is that?" he whispered. "They're close," I said, my voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, they came out of nowhere, pale figures skittering across the walls and ceiling like spiders. Their translucent skin glowed faintly in the dim light of our flashlights, and their clicking grew louder as they surrounded us. "Run!" Frank shouted, pulling out his flare gun. The creatures moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, darting between stalagmites and lunging toward us with clawed hands. Frank fired a flare into the air, temporarily blinding them with its bright red light. "Go, now!" he yelled. We sprinted down the tunnel, but it was impossible to stay together in the chaos. Peterson and I turned down one passage while Frank went another way. The creatures were everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, their clicking echoing all around us. Peterson tripped over a loose rock and fell hard onto his side. I grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet, just as one of the creatures lunged at us from behind. Its claws scraped against my backpack as we stumbled forward into a larger chamber. That's when we saw it, the nest. The chamber was massive, its walls covered in strange markings that glowed faintly in the darkness. Bones littered the floor, human bones arranged in bizarre patterns like some kind of ritualistic shrine. In the center of the room were dozens of creatures curled up together in hibernation. Peterson panicked and fired his gun wildly into the air. The noise echoed through the chamber like thunder, waking every single one of them. "Why did you do that?" I shouted as they began to stir. "I didn't mean to," he stammered, his face pale with terror. The creatures rose slowly at first, their heads tilting as they listened for us. Then they moved, hundreds of them swarming toward us like a living wave. "Follow me," I yelled, grabbing Peterson's arm again and dragging him toward an underground river at the far end of the chamber. The water was freezing cold and fast-moving, but it was our only chance. The creatures were closing in fast, their clicking growing deafening as they surrounded us on all sides. I pulled out an emergency flare from my pack and lit it just as they lunged toward us. The bright light made them recoil, their eyeless faces turning away as they screeched in pain. "Jump!" I shouted to Peterson before diving into the river. The icy water hit me like a punch to the chest, stealing my breath as it carried me downstream into total darkness. For a moment, I thought I might drown, but then I felt myself being pulled upward by a strong current. When I finally surfaced, gasping for air, I realized we had made it out of the chamber alive, but barely. The river spat us out into a shallow pool in another part of the cave system. I crawled onto the rocky shore, coughing and gasping for air, my whole body shaking from the freezing water. Peterson wasn't far behind, dragging himself out of the water and collapsing onto his back. For a moment, neither of us could speak. All I could hear was the sound of the rushing river and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. They're not following us," Peterson finally said between ragged breaths. I looked back toward the water, half expecting to see one of those pale creatures crawling out after us. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty tunnel leading back to the nest. Maybe the creatures couldn't swim, or maybe they didn't like the light from the flare I'd thrown into the chamber. Either way, we were safe for now, but Frank wasn't with us. "We have to go back," Peterson said suddenly, sitting up. His face was pale and his hands were trembling, but there was a desperate look in his eyes. "We can't leave him." I shook my head. "We can't go back in there. Not without more help." "But he's still out there." Peterson's voice cracked, and I could see tears welling up in his eyes. "We can't just leave him." I didn't know what to say. Frank had gone down a different tunnel during the chaos, and we had no idea where he was, or if he was even still alive. The thought of going back into that nest made my stomach turn, but leaving him behind felt just as wrong. "We'll call for backup," I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll get more rangers and search the tunnels together. But right now, we need to get out of here." Peterson didn't argue after that. He just nodded silently and followed me as we made our way back toward the main chambers of the cave system. Every step felt like a struggle. My legs were sore from running, my clothes were soaked and heavy, and my mind was racing with everything we'd just seen. When we finally emerged into daylight, it felt like coming up for air after being underwater for too long. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was Frank and those creatures still lurking in the darkness below. We reported everything to our supervisor as soon as we got back to the ranger station. Well, almost everything. I left out some of the details about what I'd seen in the nest, the bones, the markings on the walls, because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. Even Peterson seemed hesitant to talk about it, his face pale and his hands fidgeting nervously as he described what had happened. A full search team went into the caves early the next morning, but they didn't find Frank or any sign of him. The only thing they recovered was his watch, which had been left on a rock near one of the sealed-off passages like some kind of offering. The Park Service decided to close off that entire section of the cave system after that. They told the public it was due to structural instability caused by the earthquake, but I knew better. They didn't want anyone else going down there, not after what we'd found. Peterson quit his job a few weeks later. He couldn't handle it anymore, the nightmares, the constant fear that those creatures might come after him next. Last I heard, he'd checked himself into a mental health facility somewhere up north. As for me, I couldn't let it go. I started researching similar reports from other caves across the Southwest, stories about strange disappearances, unexplained sounds, and ancient markings deep underground. The more I looked into it, the more connections I found. It wasn't just Carlsbad, there were stories like this from caves all over the region. I started going back into the caves alone, not into that passageway where we'd found the nest, but other parts of Carlsbad and nearby systems. I brought cameras, recording equipment, anything I could use to document what I found. Most of it was just normal cave life. Bats, insects, rock formations, but every now and then, I'd hear that clicking sound again. One night, after months of searching, I decided to go back to that sealed-off passageway with specialized gear, a stronger flashlight, infrared cameras, even a small drone for mapping tight spaces. It wasn't about fear anymore, it was about answers. Before I descended into the darkness one last time, I left my journal on my desk at home with detailed notes about everything I'd seen, the creatures, their nest, even sketches of their strange markings, and a message full of, "If anything happens to me, tell people what's down there." Asterisk. The last thing anyone heard from me was a short radio transmission sent from deep within the caves. "It's them, they're evolving. It's happening before my eyes." When they sent search teams after me days later, all they found was my journal and some scattered equipment near an underground river. Months later, scientists discovered a new species of blind cave fish in a nearby system, small creatures with elongated limbs and translucent skin that looked eerily familiar. And somewhere deep beneath Carlsbad Caverns, they're still waiting. My name is Daniel Redmond, but most people just call me Dan. I'm a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington. It's a place of incredible beauty, towering trees draped in moss, endless shades of green, and a constant mist that makes it feel like another world. But in the spring of 1985, something happened in that forest, something I still can't fully explain. I wasn't always a ranger. Before this, I was a smoke jumper. One of those guys who parachutes into wildfires to fight the flames head-on. It's dangerous work, and I paid the price for it. A bad jump left me with a busted leg and burns that nearly killed me. My pocket watch stopped during that fire, and I've carried it ever since as a reminder of how close I came to death. After months of recovery and battling nightmares that wouldn't let me sleep, I transferred to Olympic National Park for a quieter life, or so I thought. The park is ancient. Its forests older than most cities. Some of the trees have been standing for over 500 years, their roots tangled with ferns and nurse logs that host new life as they decay. The air is always damp, and there's this fine mist that clings to everything, making the forest feel alive in ways you can't quite put into words. But that spring, something about the mist felt wrong. It started with reports of missing hikers along the Hoh River Trail. 3 backpackers vanished in just 2 weeks without a trace. Search teams combed the area but found nothing, not even footprints. Then there were the strange patterns of dead vegetation we kept finding, perfect circles where nothing would grow, like the life had been sucked out of the ground overnight. Wildlife started acting strange too. The Roosevelt elk herds, which usually roamed freely through the valley, were nowhere to be seen. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. And then there was the fog, thicker than I'd ever seen it before. It didn't just hang in the air. It moved, twisting and swirling like it had a mind of its own. At first I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild. After all, Olympic is known for its unpredictable weather and eerie atmosphere. But then Maggie Wilson, one of the veteran rangers I worked with, told me she'd seen something in the mist, something tall and human-shaped moving between the trees at dusk. I laughed it off at first. Maggie loved her ghost stories, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us out there in the woods. And then came the warnings. A Native American researcher visiting the park told me about the hungry ones who walk in mist. He wouldn't go into detail, but said they were ancient beings tied to the land, drawn to fear and despair like moths to a flame. A Quinault elder flat out refused to enter certain parts of the forest, saying the balance is broken. I didn't believe in ghost stories or legends back then. Not really, but when my compass started spinning wildly near one of those dead circles and my radio cut out completely, well, let's just say doubt started creeping in. The final straw came when I experienced lost time for the first time. I'd gone into one of those thick fog banks near an old grove to check on some blue-green fungi growing on the trees, fungi we'd never seen before. And when I came out on the other side, hours had passed without me realizing it. My watch said one thing, my gut said another. Something was happening in that forest, something beyond anything I'd ever dealt with before, and whether I liked it or not, I was about to find out what. After the strange fog incident, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The missing hikers, the dead circles in the grass, the weird fungi, none of it added up. I told myself it was just bad weather, maybe some natural phenomenon we didn't understand yet. But deep down I knew there was more to it. Something was wrong with the forest. The next morning, Maggie and I headed out to check one of the areas where the hikers had last been seen. Maggie's been a ranger for over 30 years, and she's seen just about everything the wilderness can throw at you. She's tough as nails, but has this calm presence that makes you feel like everything's going to be okay. That day, though, even Maggie seemed uneasy. We hiked along the Hoh River Trail, the mist hanging low over the ground like a blanket. It was colder than it should have been for spring, cold enough that frost clung to some of the shaded plants. The forest felt quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of our boots crunching on the trail. "Doesn't feel right," Maggie muttered, glancing around like she expected something to jump out at us. "I've been on this trail 100 times, and it's never felt like this." We reached one of those dead circles around midday. It was even stranger up close, perfectly round, with no signs of animals or insects anywhere near it. The grass inside was brittle and gray, like it had been drained of life, and right in the center was that blue-green fungus again, growing in clusters on a fallen log. "Ever seen anything like this before?" I asked Maggie. She shook her head. "Nope. And I don't want to stick around long enough to figure it out." As we were inspecting the area, my radio crackled to life with static. At first, I thought it was just interference from the trees. Radios don't always work well deep in the forest, but then I heard something faint through the static. A voice. "Help." It was so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "Maggie," I said, holding up my hand to silence her. "Did you hear that?" She frowned and turned her radio up. The static came again, followed by another faint whisper. "Help me." The voice sounded distant, almost like it wasn't coming from the radio at all, but from somewhere in the forest itself. "Could be one of the hikers," Maggie said quickly, already pulling out her map. "We need to check this out." We followed the sound as best we could, heading deeper into the woods where the fog grew thicker with every step. My compass stopped working completely. It just spun in circles no matter which way I turned, and Maggie's GPS refused to pick up a signal. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered under her breath. The fog seemed alive now, swirling around us like it was trying to lead us somewhere, or keep us from leaving. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, tall and thin shapes that disappeared whenever I turned to look directly at them. "Maggie," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see that?" She nodded slowly but didn't say anything. The shapes were moving now, weaving between the trees like they were watching us. They were too far away to make out clearly, just dark outlines against the mist, but they were definitely humanoid. Tall and impossibly thin with long limbs that didn't seem quite right. "Let's keep moving," Maggie said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. We pressed on until we reached a small clearing where another dead circle lay in front of us. This one was bigger than any we'd seen before, at least 20 feet across, and right in the middle stood a single figure. It wasn't human. The thing looked like it was made entirely of fog, its body shifting and swirling as if it could dissolve into mist at any moment. It had no face, just a blank space where its features should have been, and its arms hung down past its knees like they were too long for its body. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stood there staring at it while it stared back, or at least I think it did. Without eyes or a face, it was impossible to tell. Then it took a step toward us. "Maggie," I said slowly, reaching for my flare gun without taking my eyes off the thing. "Don't," she whispered sharply. "Don't provoke it." The figure stopped suddenly and tilted its head as if listening for something. Then it dissolved into mist right before our eyes and vanished into the trees. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. After what we saw in the clearing, Maggie and I didn't talk much on the hike back to the ranger station. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like we were both trying to make sense of something that didn't belong in the world we knew. Every so often, Maggie would glance over her shoulder, and I couldn't blame her. I kept feeling like something was following us, just out of sight. When we got back, I grabbed my journal and started writing everything down. The dead circles, the strange fog, the figure in the mist. I'd been keeping track of odd things in the park for years, but this was different. This wasn't just weird weather or a strange animal sighting. This felt like something ancient, something that had been here long before us. The next day, I decided to head out alone. Maggie wasn't happy about it. She said it wasn't safe, but I needed answers. There was an old grove deep in the forest that I'd heard about from some of the Quinaul elders. They called it a place where the mist never lifts. If there were answers anywhere, I figured they'd be there. The hike to the grove was long and quiet. The deeper I went into the forest, the thicker the fog became. It clung to me like a second skin, cold and damp, and muffled every sound except for my own breathing and footsteps. Even the usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves were gone. When I finally reached the grove, it felt like stepping into another world. The trees here were massive, their trunks covered in thick moss that glowed faintly green in the dim light. The air was colder than it should have been, and frost glittered on the ground despite it being spring. And then I saw them. At first they were just shadows moving through the mist, tall and thin with long limbs that didn't move quite right. But as they came closer, their shapes became clearer. They weren't solid like you or me. They were made of swirling fog, their bodies shifting and changing with every step. They had no faces, no eyes or mouths, just blank spaces where features should have been. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. One of them stopped a few feet away from me and tilted its head like it was studying me. It didn't make a sound, not even a whisper, but I could feel something in my mind, like a pressure pushing against my thoughts. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it before my instincts kicked in and I raised my camera. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it, but somehow I managed to snap a picture. The flash went off, lighting up the grove for a split second, and then they were gone. Just like that. The mist swallowed them up as if they'd never been there at all. I stood there for a long time after that, trying to catch my breath and convince myself that what I'd seen was real. When I finally looked at the photo on my camera's screen, my stomach dropped. The figures were there, faint but unmistakable, standing among the trees like silent sentinels. On my way back to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me from somewhere in the fog. Every time I turned around, though, there was nothing but trees and mist. When I got back and showed Maggie the photo, she went pale. "They're real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," I said quietly. "They're real." We spent hours going over everything we knew, or thought we knew, about what was happening in the park. The dead circles, the missing hikers, even those strange fungi growing where the fog lingered, it all seemed connected somehow. But no matter how hard we tried to piece it together, we couldn't figure out what these things were or what they wanted. The only thing we knew for sure was that they weren't just some natural phenomenon or trick of light and shadow. They were alive, and they were dangerous. A few days after we saw the mistwalkers in the grove, the call came in. A family of 4, 2 parents and their kids, a boy and a girl, had gone missing while hiking near the Hoh River Trail. My stomach sank when I heard the news. This wasn't just hikers getting lost anymore. Something was taking people, and we were running out of time to figure out what. Maggie and I joined the search team early the next morning. The fog was thicker than ever, rolling through the trees like smoke. It felt heavier too, almost like it was pressing down on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. We split into pairs to cover more ground. Maggie and I took one section of the forest while the others fanned out in different directions. The plan was to meet back at the trailhead by sunset, but deep down I knew we wouldn't all make it back. The deeper we went, the stranger things got. Our radios stopped working within an hour, just static no matter how much we adjusted them. My compass was useless again, spinning wildly every time I checked it. Even my watch started acting up, ticking faster than it should have before stopping altogether. "Dan," Maggie said suddenly, her voice low and tense. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. At first there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like someone crying. "It's coming from over there," she said, pointing toward a dense patch of fog. We moved cautiously toward the sound, our flashlights cutting through the mist in thin beams. The crying grew louder as we got closer, and my chest tightened when I realized it sounded like a child. When we finally reached the source of the noise, my blood ran cold. Slumped against a tree was one of the missing backpackers, alive but barely. His skin was pale and wrinkled like he'd aged decades in just a few days. His eyes were wide open but blank, staring at nothing. "Hey," Maggie said, kneeling beside him and shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" "What happened?" He didn't respond, not even a blink. "We need to get him out of here," I said, but as soon as I stepped closer, something moved in the fog behind him. "Maggie," I whispered, my hand tightening on her arm. She looked up just as one of the mist walkers emerged from the fog. It stood there silently, its blank face tilted slightly as if watching us, or maybe warning us. Back away, Maggie said quietly, pulling me with her as she stood up. But before we could move far, more of them appeared. No, 4, maybe more than that. They surrounded us in a loose circle, their tall forms blending with the mist so perfectly that they seemed like part of it. Then they started moving closer. Run, Maggie shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward an opening between 2 trees. We ran blindly through the forest, dodging branches and roots as best we could in the thick fog. The mist walkers didn't chase us outright, they didn't need to. The fog itself seemed to shift and swirl around us like it was alive, cutting off paths and forcing us to turn back toward them again and again. Eventually, we stumbled into a ravine where the fog was so dense that I could barely see my own hand in front of me. That's when we found them. The missing family. The parents were lying on the ground, their bodies pale and lifeless, like they'd been drained of everything that made them human. The 2 kids were huddled together nearby, their skin starting to take on that same grayish hue as the backpacker we'd found earlier. We have to get them out of here, Maggie said urgently. I nodded and scooped up the boy while Maggie grabbed his sister's hand. They were both weak, but still breathing, barely. As we turned to leave, the mistwalkers appeared again, stepping out of the fog like ghosts. There were more of them now, dozens at least, and they were closing in fast. Maggie, I started to say, but she cut me off. Go, she shouted. Get them out of here. I'll hold them off. No, I yelled back. We stick together, but she wasn't listening anymore. She pulled out her pack of emergency flares and lit one with a snap before tossing it toward the nearest mistwalker. The creature recoiled from the bright light and heat, but didn't disappear entirely. It just dissolved into mist for a moment before reforming a few feet away. Fireworks, she shouted over her shoulder as she lit another flare and waved it at them like a torch. I hesitated for only a second before turning and running with both kids in tow. Behind me, I could hear Maggie shouting at the creatures as she fought to keep them at bay. The path back to safety felt endless. The boy in my arms grew heavier with every step while his sister stumbled along beside me, her grip on my hand growing weaker by the second. The fog seemed determined to stop us, thickening around our feet and pulling at our clothes like invisible hands. But somehow we kept going. When we finally broke through into clearer air near the trailhead, I collapsed onto my knees with exhaustion. The boy was still breathing faintly in my arms, but his sister, she was gone. Not dead exactly, but fading into mist right before my eyes until there was nothing left of her but air. I wanted to go back for Maggie. I really did, but when I looked behind me at that wall of fog where she'd stayed behind, I knew it was too late. I sat there on the trailhead, holding the boy in my arms, staring into the fog that had swallowed Maggie and the girl. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and my chest was so tight I could barely breathe. I wanted to go back. I wanted to scream her name and charge into that mist with whatever strength I had left. But deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. Maggie was gone. They'd taken her. The boy stirred weakly, pulling me back to reality. His skin was cold, his breathing shallow. I had to get him help before it was too late. Somehow, I forced myself to stand and started walking toward the ranger station, every step feeling like it might be my last. By the time I reached the station, the boy was barely conscious. The other rangers rushed to help as soon as they saw me, but when they asked where Maggie was, I couldn't bring myself to answer. All I could do was shake my head. The boy was taken to the hospital that night. He survived, but he never spoke again. Not a single word about what happened in the forest or what he'd seen. The doctors said he was in shock, but I knew better. Whatever those things were, those mistwalkers, they'd left a mark on him that no one could fix. The official report blamed everything on hypothermia and disorientation caused by the fog. They said the family had gotten lost and that Maggie had died trying to save them. No one wanted to hear about creatures made of mist or circles of dead grass or compasses spinning out of control. It was easier for them to write it off as a tragic accident, but I couldn't let it go. I spent weeks going over my notes and researching anything I could find about strange phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. Legends, old stories, unexplained disappearances. It all started to fit together in a way that made my skin crawl. The mistwalkers weren't new. They'd been here for centuries, maybe longer, hidden in the fog and feeding on the life around them. The blue-green fungus we'd found, it wasn't just some weird plant. It was spreading through the forest like a sickness, creating more fog and drawing those things closer to where people lived and hiked. It wasn't just about losing hikers anymore. The balance Maggie had talked about was breaking. A few months later, I packed up my gear and went back to the grove alone. I told no one where I was going, not even my supervisor, because I knew they wouldn't understand. This wasn't about finding answers anymore. It was about stopping whatever was happening before it got worse. I brought everything I thought I'd need: cameras, flares, even a portable heater. But when I reached the grove again, none of it mattered. The mistwalkers were waiting for me this time. They didn't attack right away. They just stood there in the fog, watching me with their blank faces, as if daring me to come closer. And for some reason I couldn't explain, I did. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of light and cold and a strange feeling like I was being pulled apart piece by piece. The last thing I remember is looking down at my pocket watch, the one that had stopped during the fire all those years ago, and seeing its hands moving backward. When search teams went looking for me a week later, all they found was my journal and my pocket watch lying on the ground near the grove. The watch was charred black again, just like it had been after the fire. They never found my body. That spring, some of the rangers started reporting strange sightings in the fog, tall figures moving between the trees or a man with a limp walking along the trails before vanishing into thin air. One of them swore he heard someone whisper his name when he got too close to one of those dead circles. They say Olympic National Park is still beautiful, still full of life, but if you ever visit, you might notice something feels off. The mist clings a little too tightly. Shadows move where they shouldn't, and every so often you'll hear footsteps behind you when no one's there. And if you see a figure limping through the fog with a charred pocket watch in his hand, well, maybe it's best not to follow him.